Hello, I'm your host Parth, and welcome everyone to our insightful podcast. I'm really excited about today's topic because it's something we all hear about, yet many of us still struggle with, and that is mindfulness. With the fast pace of our modern lives, trying to be present can feel like an impossible task, and we often wonder if we are even doing it right. Today, we will be diving deep into the common challenges people face while practicing mindfulness and how can we overcome them. And to help us navigate this, we are having the special guest, Miss Megha. Miss Megha, it's a pleasure to have you here. Can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, Parth. Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and really looking forward to talking about such an important topic. As per my introduction, I'm working at an MNC as a consultant since the last 3 years. And one thing that I've learned from being in corporate is the importance of mindfulness. Mindfulness has become increasingly popular, but as you mentioned, it is not without its challenges. I think it's wonderful that we are having this conversation today.
There are a lot of discussion and buzz around mindfulness, especially in recent years, but there are definitely some hurdles people encounter while trying to incorporate it into their lives. Before we can dive into those, let's start with the basics for anyone who might be new to this. Could you briefly explain what mindfulness is?
Of course, mindfulness at its core is the practice of being fully present and engaged in the current moment. It's about observing what is happening right now, whether it is our thoughts, emotions, or the environment around us, without judgment. So instead of getting caught up in worries about the future or regrets about the past, we try to ground ourselves in the present moment. But as simple as it sounds, it is not easy. Our minds are naturally wired to wander, and in a world filled with distractions, staying present can be quite challenging.
Exactly, and that leads us right into today's topic, right? What makes mindfulness so difficult for so many people? It seems like a paradox being present should be the simplest thing in the world, right? But it's not. So, Miss Megha, what would you say is the number one challenge people face when they start practicing mindfulness?
Great question. One of the most common challenges is restlessness or an inability to focus. People often find that when they sit down to meditate or to try, to practice mindfulness, their minds wander almost immediately. Instead of focusing on their breath or being in the present, their thoughts start racing. Did I send that email? What I'm going to have for dinner? What if that meeting tomorrow doesn't go well? And so on. It's like their minds have a mind of their own.
Oh, that sounds familiar. I think many of us can relate to that experience. You sit down to be mindful, and before you know it, you are deep into a mental to do list.
Exactly. But the first thing I tell people is that this is completely normal. Our brains are designed to think, it's their job. The goal of mindfulness isn't to stop thinking altogether. Rather, it's about noticing when your mind has wandered and gently bringing your attention back to the present moment. That is the practice. Every time you catch yourself drifting and refocus your attention, you are building your mindfulness muscle.
I love that analogy. Like the idea of mindfulness being like a muscle that you strengthen over time. So, what advice would you give to someone who's really struggling with this wandering mind problem?
I would say one of the best things to do is to start small. Actually, people often, set themselves up for failure by trying to meditate for longer periods, like 20 or 30 minutes, when they're just, even beginning. If you're finding it hard to stay focused, start with just 5 minutes. It is much more manageable, and over time, you can gradually extend the duration as your ability to focus improves. And another tip would be to be kind to yourself. Don't beat yourself up when your mind wanders. Instead, I would just suggest just notice it and gently bring your attention back, whether that is to your breath, a mantra, or even the sensations in your body. The more compassion you show yourself during the practice, the more you'll stick with it.
That's such an important point, being kind to ourselves in the process. It's so easy to fall into self criticism. Now, another thing I've heard a lot of people is like that they struggle to find time for mindfulness and they are very busy in their own lives. We all are working so much and we have family, we have personal commitments. How can someone realistically fit mindfulness into their already busy schedule?
I have heard this quite often. Life these days it's very hectic and carving out 20 minutes to sit in silence can feel almost impossible. But mindfulness doesn't always have to look like a formal meditation. You can practice it throughout your day. Like, for example, whether you are eating a meal, instead of rushing through it, you can slow down and really savor each bite, noticing the flavors or textures. Or while when you are walking, pay attention to how your feet feel on the ground and how the air feels on your skin. You can also practice what I call is mindfulness moments. These are tiny pockets of mindfulness that you can integrate into your day, like taking a few mindful breaths before a meeting or while waiting in line. Even just a few seconds of mindfulness can make a difference in how centered and present you feel.
I mean, yes, that's true. Like, it takes away the pressure of thinking mindfulness has to be this long, formal practice. Like, speaking of pressure, another challenge people often face is when emotions come up during mindfulness practice. Sometimes, when people are sitting in silence, uncomfortable feelings like anxiety, sadness, or stress starts to bubble up. How should someone handle that according to you?
Yes, this is a big one. When we practice mindfulness, we are not just becoming aware of our thoughts, we are also becoming, more aware of our emotions. And often, those emotions are ones we have been avoiding. It can be uncomfortable and sometimes even overwhelming when difficult feelings start to surface. The main key here, I think, it would be acceptance. Mindfulness teaches us to observe our emotions without judgment. So instead of labeling these emotions like good or bad, we learn to sit with them and acknowledge them as a part of our experience. One helpful technique I learned is to label the emotion. For example, if you're feeling anxious, you can silently say to yourself, I am noticing anxiety. This simple act of naming the emotion can create some distance between you and the feeling and probably, making it less overwhelming.
That's really insightful. It's almost like you can feel your emotions and you are giving your attention to your emotions rather than trying to push it away or ignore it.
Exactly. Because when we resist emotions, they tend to persist or grow even stronger. But when we acknowledge them, we can work with them more skillfully. And over time, this practice really helps people develop a healthy relationship with their emotions.
What I think is that it takes time. Though, I mean, learning to sit with difficult emotions cannot be easy, especially if you have spent years avoiding them and you suddenly face them.
Absolutely. It is not something that happens overnight, but with practice, people often find that they are able to navigate their emotions with more ease. They become less reactive and more able to choose how they respond, which is incredibly empowering.
That brings us to another challenge, which is judging ourselves during the practice. I know a lot of people feel like they are bad at mindfulness because their minds wander or they can't sit still. they don't have patience. How can people overcome this self judgment?
I believe self judgment is one of the biggest obstacles to mindfulness. We tend to be our own harshest critics. People, I have heard people, telling me that I am terrible at mindfulness because I get distracted all the time. And so have I experienced this in my earlier phases of life. But the truth is that everybody gets distracted. Mindfulness, it's not about perfection. It's about noticing when you get distracted and bringing yourself back to the present moment again and again. And this is, I believe, a very, very important learning that I have gained. One solution to practice self compassion would be very helpful. Like when you notice those critical thoughts, try to counter them with some kindness. You might say yourself, it's okay that I got distracted. That is a part of the practice. I am doing the best I can. And over time, this compassionate attitude can transform how you relate to yourself, not just in mindfulness, but in life.
I mean, exactly. Just being gentle with yourself, that is so important. One of the last challenges I want to touch on is something I think a lot of people are experiencing more and more these days is discomfort with stillness. Like they are not comfortable with sitting for like even 15 to 20 minutes alone without any object or without any person. With our constant connection to phones, social media, and non-stop information, many people find it really hard just sit still. How can we work through the discomfort?
Parth, you are absolutely right. Our society has, become so accustomed to constant stimulation that stillness can, almost feel unbearable for some people. It's like the moment we stop, we feel this urge to check our phones or do something productive or, just open our phone and then close it. But this discomfort with stillness is actually a sign that mindfulness is working. It is showing us how just restless our minds can be. Uh, I think one way to ease into the stillness is would be to incorporate movement. For example, mindful walking, yoga, or even mindful stretching can help bridge the gap between constant activity.
That's such a great tip, like to incorporate mindful movement. It sounds like a gentle way to introduce stillness into our lives without feeling overwhelmed by it. And I would like to explore another dimension of mindfulness challenges before we close this enlightening conversation. One thing that often comes up is the misconception of mindfulness. Like a lot of people think mindfulness is about clearing the mind completely or being in a constant state of calm. But in reality, it's like much more nuanced that could you talk about how these misconceptions can become barriers for people?
That is a fantastic point, and it is something I've seen people talking about it quite sometimes. So, there's this myth that in order to be good at mindfulness, your mind should be completely still and you should feel serene all the time. This couldn't be further from the truth. Mindfulness isn't always about, getting rid of thoughts or emotions. It's about learning to observe them without getting caught up in them. It is about accepting that your mind will wander, that emotions will arise, and that discomfort is a part of the process. What I think is that a lot of people feel like they are failing at mindfulness if they don't feel peaceful immediately. But really, this practice is about being present with whatever is happening, whether that is peace, anxiety, frustration, or distraction. That is why I I'm emphasizing the importance of non judgment in mindfulness. If we approach the practice with the expectation that we'll be perfectly calm, we are setting ourselves up for frustration.
So it's almost like we're looking for a quick fix with mindfulness and hoping that it will be a magic solution to our stress or anxiety. But from what you are saying, it sounds like the practice itself is more about acceptance rather than transformation. What do you say?
Exactly. And that is a tough pill to swallow for many of us, especially in a world that values productivity and quick results. We are conditioned to think in terms of doing rather than being. So, when people start practicing mindfulness, they often feel like they should be achieving something. But I feel that mindfulness is the opposite. It is about letting go of the need to achieve and simply being present with whatever arises. This shift of mindset can be quite a challenge, but once people embrace it, they often find that mindfulness becomes less of a chore and more of a refuge. It's not something you do to check off your to do list, it's a way of being that you can cultivate over time.
I love that phrase mindfulness as a refuge, as you said. That's such a powerful way to think about it. But I imagine that this shift in mindset takes time. You know, like, are there any techniques or practices that can help people ease into this less goal oriented way of practicing mindfulness, according to you?
Yes, I believe there are a few techniques that can help with this. One would be to practice curiosity instead of striving. So, I think instead of thinking, I need to achieve a state of calm, you might approach your practice with curiosity. Like, what is happening in my body right now? What emotions are coming up for me? What thoughts am I noticing? This curious, open attitude allows you to explore experience without judgment or pressure. And I think that another technique would be to focus on sensory awareness. Often when we try to be mindful, we are too focused on our thoughts. But mindfulness isn't just about observing your thoughts, it is also about tuning into your body and your senses, paying attention to physical sensations like the feeling of your breath or the sounds around you can help ground you in the present moment and take some of the pressure off your mind. And lastly, incorporating gratitude into your mindfulness practice can be quite transformative. At the end of your practice, you should take a moment to reflect on something you are grateful for, whether it is the fact that you showed up for yourself, or the warmth of the sun on your face, or even the opportunity to take a mindful breath. Gratitude helps shift the focus from what is not going right to what is already abundant in our lives.
That's such a beautiful advice, Miss Mega. And I think sometimes we forget that mindfulness is not just about what's happening in our heads, but about how we are experiencing the world around us. And I can see how gratitude would help anchor us in the present. Another area that I think might be challenging, especially for those who are just starting out, is the feeling of impatience. We live in such a fast paced world where we are used to immediate results, whether it's instant information from our phones or next day delivery from online shopping nowadays. When people don't see the benefits of mindfulness right way, it's kind of easy to get discouraged. What do you suggest for someone who feels like mindfulness is not working for them?
Uh, I would say impatience is a very natural challenge, especially in the early stages of practice. We live in a results driven culture, and it is easy to think that I have been practicing for a week. Why don't I feel more calm yet? But mindfulness isn't like a quick fix pill. It is more like a long term investment in your mental and emotional health. The benefits often appear gradually and subtly over time. I always tell people to trust the process. Even if you don't notice immediate changes, every moment of mindfulness is helping to rewire your brain for greater awareness, patience, and resilience. It is like planting a seed. You won't see it sprout overnight, but that does not mean that nothing is happening beneath the surface. It can also help to reflect on the small shifts. Maybe you noticed that you paused before reacting in a stressful situation, or maybe you caught yourself being a bit more present during a conversation. So, these small moments are signs of progress, even if they don't feel like earth shattering changes. And if someone is feeling particularly impatient or frustrated, it can be useful to practice mindfulness around those feelings. So instead of trying to push them away, bring curiosity to them. What does impatience feel like in your body? Where do you feel it? What thoughts come up around it? So, this kind of exploration can be incredibly illuminating, and can actually deepen your mindfulness practice.
That is such a great way to reframe impatience, like not as something to get rid of, but as something to explore and learn from. It really highlights how mindfulness is about observing whatever is happening without trying to change or control it. One more challenge I wanted to touch on before we move to the conclusion is mindfulness in the face of external distractions. So, in our daily lives, we are bombarded by notifications, emails, social media updates, and constant demands on our attention. How can people practice mindfulness in such a distracting world?
That is right. That is like really one of the biggest challenges today. Our attention is, constantly being pulled in a million different directions. But I like to think of distractions as an opportunity to practice mindfulness in real world situations. So, instead of seeing them as obstacles, we can use them as a chance to deepen our practice. So, like for example, when your phone buzzes with a notification, so instead of immediately reacting and picking it up, pause for a moment. You will notice the urge to check your phone and observe how it feels in your body. So, this simple act of pausing and noticing is mindfulness in action. And another strategy would be to create mindful boundaries with technology. We can you can set specific times during the day when you'll track your emails or your social media and try to focus on one thing at a time. So multitasking might feel productive, but it actually scatters our attention and makes it harder to be mindful. And I would say finally, embrace mindful transitions. So, when you move from one activity to the next, whether it is between meetings or from, work to home life, take a few mindful breaths to center yourself. These small moments of mindfulness throughout the day can help you anchor amidst the distractions.
Those were such practical and sensible tips, Miss Mega. And I think the idea of seeing distractions as opportunities for mindfulness is especially powerful. It really flips the narrative and empowers us to be more intentional in our daily lives. This has been such an enriching conversation. We have covered a lot of ground, from misconceptions about mindfulness to dealing with impatience to navigating distractions in a digital world. And I'm sure our listeners have gained some invaluable insights, and I know I will be taking a lot away from this conversation myself.
Thank you so much, Parth, for having me here. It's been a pleasure to discuss these challenges, and I hope that the conversation has provided some encouragement for those who are on their mindfulness journey. It is quite important to remember that challenges are a natural part of the process and they can lead to some of the greatest growth.
Absolutely. And to everyone listening this podcast, we hope today's podcast has given you the tools and the inspiration to keep going on with your mindfulness practice even when it gets tough and rough. The key takeaway here is that mindfulness is not about perfection. It's about showing up, being present and cultivating a kinder relationship with yourself. Always remember that mindfulness is a journey, and like any journey, it's the small steps we take every day that matter the most. Thank you again to Miss Megha for sharing her wisdom with us, and to all of you, thank you for tuning in. Stay mindful, stay compassionate, and we'll see you later.